First things first, let's look at the Blender interface for people that have never opened the program before. Now the goal of this course is that anybody can follow along. I plan to move slowly and I'll have the keystrokes recording on the screen. That being said, it can be confusing following along in Blender for the first time. So before you find yourself getting too confused or frustrated, just pause and check out some of the resources I've posted in the description below. There I've posted some basic overviews of Blender that are great for absolute beginners if you're having a hard time following along. That being said, let's get started and look at Blender together. Here we are in Blender, and I will be having the shortcuts down here at the bottom right for you to follow along with. I'll be using version 2.91 as it's the most recent of this recording. However, you should be able to follow along with pretty much any version unless you're using a very old version. So first, let's go over navigation. So of course, moving around the 3D viewport is going to be a big part of what we're doing. So let's look at how we can do that. Most simply, up here we have view, we can go to viewport, and we can change the different views here. So we can snap to our front view, right view, or left view. So if I go ahead and click that, you'll see that it'll snap there. You'll also see that there is the keyboard shortcuts next to it. So if you have a numpad, you can see that you have control numpad 7 for bottom, numpad 7 for top. So 7 will take you to top and control will take you to the bottom. So you can also use the numpad to navigate. That's what I like to use the most. If you're a beginner, the most easy may be up here. You can take this gizmo here and you can drag this gizmo around, rotate around your view, and then you can click these to kind of snap into views. If you're not sure which view you're in, or if you get yourself turned around, you can see up here that we have the view that we're in. So here we're in the bottom. So if I go ahead and click here, it'll take us to the front. And if I click here, it'll take us to the top. So that might be the simplest way to navigate. Now it's highly recommended that you have a 3-button mouse to navigate around. So if you hold Shift middle, you'll be able to kind of pan around your view. And if you hold just middle, you will rotate around the center of whatever you're viewing. And then if you hold Control middle, you can zoom in and out. Alternatively, you can use a mouse wheel to zoom in and out. So that's the basics of moving around the viewport. Now with our animation, we'll mostly be snapped into the front view, so I wouldn't worry too much, but this does take some time getting used to. Next, let's take a look at how we can move objects, specifically with our position, rotation, and scale. So the simplest way is that if we select an object here, and we come up here, we have these gizmos. So up top here we have the select box, and that just gives us a selection cursor that we can drag a box and select multiple objects with. I'm just going to go ahead and click this object to select this one. And then here we have the move gizmo. And what that does is pops up a little gizmo here. And you can see we have these arrows, these squares, and the circle, and that's uniform across all of these gizmos here. So if you grab one of these, you'll move only on that axis. So because we're in 3D, we have 3 axes, X, Y, and Z, and you can see that they're color coordinated. And if you can't remember what's which, it says up here X, Y, and Z for our red, green, and blue. So we can see we can move this here on the X axis. If we grab these squares, it'll do both. So if we grab this square here, it'll move it only on the X and the Y axis. And then this white circle here, if we grab it, it will move it in whatever view we are looking. So if we move over here, you can see that it moves there. Now that's the move gizmo. If we come here to the rotation gizmo, we get a similar thing. If we grab here on the white, we can rotate it from whatever view we're at. If we grab here on the red, we can move it on the X-axis and so on. And then of course you can grab in between and move those as well. Here we have the scale, just like the move gizmo works the same way. We can kind of scale on each of those axes, or we can kind of scale it up uniform if we grab in the circle. So that's how you can go about moving and adjusting your objects, and that's how we'll be using our bones when we go to control our character later. Next, let's talk about view modes. So right now we're in what is called solid mode, and we have these different views up here. Now, if you go to viewport shading wireframe up here, you'll see that we have a wireframe. And if we click here in solid, you'll see that we have a solid view of our objects, which is what we'll be animating in most. Here we have a material view where it will preview the materials, and then here we have rendered mode where it will show what it looks like rendered. It'll give you a preview of your render, but this will take longer to load. So most of the time we'll be animating here in the solid view. Another way you can switch those is if you tap the Z key, you can go ahead and it'll open a wheel and you can hover over those and pick that. Now, to show you how to get that wheel and the tab wheel that I have here, let's first look at some of my preferences I have that are a little bit different that I feel make it a little bit easier to navigate around Blender. So if you go to Preferences and you go to Key Map, I have select with left mouse button on. My spacebar action is search. And then I have select all toggles. And then I also have tab for pie menu checked. So I'd go ahead and mimic those settings. And what those do is make sure that when you click with the left button, that's how you're going to select objects. And then when you hit spacebar, it'll give you this search bar, which you can use to search anything in Blender, which can be pretty handy. And we may use that later. And then select all, as if you tap the A on the keyboard, it will select all the items in the scene, which we'll be using quite a bit. Tab for pie menu means that when you press tab on your keyboard, these different things will show up here, which we'll be using later when we enter pose mode. But we don't need to worry about that right now. If you were going to edit your objects, you could tab into edit mode here, and then you could begin editing your object. However, we won't be doing that in this course because we'll be focusing on how to animate our characters. Now there's quite a few other things we can do here in the viewport, specifically with edit mode. However, we'll be focusing on animation. If you're curious about learning about some of these other aspects of the program, I recommend you check out Making Your First 3D Character, and where I dive into how to edit the model and some of the tools to do that, and how to add and delete objects and other things such as that. But right now, we'll just focus on what we need for animation. So let's go up here, and we have our little collection view up here. So this, if you've ever used an Adobe program, is kind of like your layer system, and that you can kind of toggle these and you can turn on and off the visibility of objects or turn them off entirely so they don't even render. We'll be diving into this a bit more when we do the rendering video, but all you need to know is that up here you have your collections and you can select your objects up here. So if I grab the cube, you see that it grabs the cube, and if I grab the camera, you see that it grabs the camera. And you need to know about this little eye that will toggle on and off the visibility of your objects. We'll be using that later to kind of turn off some of our background elements. And then here we have this check mark here, which will turn it off, not just visible in the viewport, but also when we click render, it will turn that off. If that doesn't make sense, it will more when we get into the rendering section. Now you'll notice that there's a lot going on here. We have the timeline down here, and we're going to dive more into the timeline and the dope sheet editor and the graph editor when we dive into the animation interface. You'll see that we have all these tabs up here and we have all these tabs over here. Now these aren't going to be necessary for us to animate, so we're not going to do much in here. We'll dive into some of the render settings that are over here, but I'll give you a quick brief overview of kind of the interface. So up here we have our layout, which is default, which allows us to make our own custom layout. But if you click through these, you can see that they have different presets for each. So here we have a modeling layout, a sculpting layout, a UV editing layout, texture painting, and we have a shading layout, which you can use to create materials. We have an animation layout. We have a rendering layout. We have a compositing layout and a scripting layout. Now we're just going to be working in here and making our own layout. And you can change any window you're in by coming up here and clicking this little button here, and then you can change what your viewport is. Now, a lot of these might not make sense, and we're only going to be using a couple, so don't worry if you get a bit lost. But what you can do is you can click on any corner here, and you can drag to open a new window. So let's go ahead here. We'll click to drag a window there, and you can see now we have two windows. So if we wanted, we could animate with one in the top view and one in the front view. Or we can go ahead here and you can click Dope Sheet Editor, and that'll open all of our keyframes so that when we're over here animating our character, we could go ahead and animate here in the front view and edit our keyframes there. We'll dive into the Dope Sheet Editor a bit more in the next video. If you accidentally create a window and want to get rid of it, you can come down here, you can click this button here, and then you can drag over and you'll see that little arrow and you can make that snap back together in the window. Now over here we have quite a bit of options. Here we have the render tab, which is where we can set kind of our render settings for when we want to turn it into a video. Here we have our scene settings. That'll be kind of like the resolution of your video or color management, things like that, where your files are going to go. Here we have layers. This is for when you're doing complex kind of compositing. This is something we will not be covering in the series. Here we have our scene settings, so that's where you can set like your units and your gravity, your audio, and all those kind of things if you're doing simulations. Here's the world properties, so there's a lot of settings there that have to do with rendering as well. Here's the object properties. This is based on whatever object you have, and it'll tell you what it's parented to, instances, motion paths, visibility, quite a bit of complex things there. Here we have the modifier panel. This is where you can add effects kind of to your modifier. If you're familiar with After Effects, it's similar to that. So you could go ahead, add a subdivision surface, and we'll see it subdivides that, but we can delete it. So anything we do here is not permanent unless if we apply it. Here's the particle tab if you were going to use particles, so you could use that for hair, adding particles to an object. Here we have physics, so if you were doing things like collision or cloth. Here we have the object constraint, and this is kind of for like complicated rigs and things that we won't be covering in this series. Here we have object data, and there's quite a bit in here, including the vertex group, shape keys, normals, and a lot of other things. Here we have material tabs, and this is more of a simple one where we can go ahead and add our materials here. And then if we go over to the shading, for example, we can go ahead, grab our materials there, and we could edit all of our shading down there. Again, if this is overwhelming, don't worry. We won't be using a lot of these in the course. It's going to be pretty simple. Down here we have the texture properties where we can add textures to our objects. I cover a lot more of these in my other course if you're interested in diving into those more, but like I said, in this course we're going to dive into the animation more. So in the next video, let's take a look at the animation interface and what we'll be using mostly during our course. One other thing to take note of is if you don't see your tools here, or if you see this popping out here and you don't see that appearing on your screen, which gives you a lot of tools there in the tabs that we may use later, is you can actually open those by pressing N and T. So T will close and open your toolbar, and N will open and close your properties over here. And that's something that we may do throughout the course. One more way we can move our objects around, which can be quite helpful when you're doing the posing with the characters later, is through using keyboard shortcuts. Now, this may be hard if it's your first time, but if you're comfortable, they're actually a lot easier to use. So if you press R, you can rotate. And again, it'll rotate from the view however you want. If you press X, it'll do it on the X axis. If you press Y, it'll do it on the Y axis, and so on. And the same thing goes for move and scale, but scale is S, and G is for move, but you can think of it as G for grab, and that will also do the same thing. And a great thing about that is you can actually input numbers, and this is where it gets kind of complicated for beginners, but I highly recommend trying to work towards this. So let's say we want to rotate this cube 45 degrees on the x-axis. You can actually just type that in. So if I press R, you see it pops up and that we can rotate there. And then if I type 45, it's going to do it from whatever view we have, but I can then press X and it'll do it on the x-axis, or Y, or Z. And if I tap Z again, it'll get rid of it and turn it back to the orientation. And you can do that for all of them. So you can move them on the y-axis, you can scale them on the x-axis. So you could do scale. So I press S, and then if I do 5, it'll make it 5 times bigger. You can also even do math in there. So if I do S, and then I do an asterisk, and then I do by 0.25, you can see there that it'll scale it down to 1/4 of what it was before. So that's one thing to work up to. We'll try not use that too much in this course because I know it's kind of hard to follow along with, but I highly recommend getting familiar with those controls.